Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to another session of the Microstructure Exchange. This is our last session of the fall 2024 series. Excited to see you here. Today we have Daniel Chen, who'll be presenting about optimal exchange design. Before I turn it over to him, let me make just one announcement, and that's to remind you about our call for papers. We're looking for submissions for consideration for our spring series. And the submission portal is on our website at the Microstructure Exchange. And just a reminder that the submission deadline is coming up soon. That's going to be December 15th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. So please submit your work, and we look forward to collecting a nice batch of papers. With that, I'll turn it over to Daniel. Daniel has said that he's happy to take clarifying questions throughout. So if you have a clarifying question, raise your hand at any time. If you have more of a big picture question, he'll be having two pauses to collect those. And just a reminder that, due to the Zoom bombing incident that we had last spring, we've cranked up our security measures. And so if you want to ask a question, the way to do that is to raise your hand. Then I'll see that and I'll push a button that allows you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. All right, so Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. So thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be present here at the Microstructure Exchange. And let me thank all of the organizers, Bjorn, Katya, Josh, Andreas, Cameron, and Andre for putting all of this together. And also I want to thank Josh for moderating the session. Okay, so this particular paper is called Optimal Exchange Design. And the goal of the paper is to conduct a mechanism design analysis for what I think has become a workhorse model setting in finance market microstructure. So to motivate the analysis, let me just start with a few observations. So if we look out at modern financial markets, trade happens in a variety of different ways, including the central limit order book, the uniform price double auction, dark pool, and also via search and bargaining and over-the-counter markets. Okay. Moreover, most trading institutions are designed, at least in part, with the goal of generating revenue. Okay. So in light of these observations, a number of questions come to mind. Okay. So which trading mechanisms are in fact optimal, either when it comes to maximizing revenue or allocative efficiency, or some combination of the two? Okay, do these theoretically optimal mechanisms resemble institutions that we actually see used in practice? How do the answers to these questions depend on various qualitative features of the market, like whether there's adverse selection resulting from private information about assets' cash payoffs, or if there's heterogeneity among traders, or if there are multiple assets in the market? Okay, and how well do prices aggregate information if the trading mechanisms are chosen endogenously and can vary with the environment? Which trading mechanisms offer good guarantees of allocative efficiency that are robust to adverse selection resulting from private information about assets payoffs? And which information structures, that is, joint distributions between traders, signals of fundamentals and also the fundamental, are especially difficult for mechanisms to deal with, and which robust mechanisms must guard against? Okay, so these are some important questions. I'm not claiming to be the first guy to investigate these questions or to pose them. There's a rich literature in microtheory that deals with related issues. But I think it's fair to say there's been much less analysis of these sorts of problems for settings that are well tailored to the financial market context. And I'll be a bit more precise about what I mean by that in just a few slides. So that's the objective of this paper. I want to conduct a mechanism design analysis of trade for a workhorse model setting that we often use to model finance market microstructure. And in particular, I'm talking about a setting in which there are several large and strategic traders who have holding costs which are quadratic in their post-trade asset positions, okay, and who are privately endowed with some quantities of these assets at the start. Okay, and a key property of my analysis is that I'm able to characterize optimal mechanisms for environments covering a range of different qualitative features, including when there are private signals about cash payoffs, when there are multiple assets, when there's heterogeneity among traders, and to a more limited degree when there's dynamics. Okay. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm able to characterize optimal mechanisms across all of these different settings in full generality. That's not the case. In order to allow for a flexible design of mechanisms, I have to make some rather strong and restrictive distributional assumptions on traders' private information. This is because of the well-known technical challenges associated with multidimensional screening, which is going to be an inherent property of the problem whenever there are multiple assets or there's also private signals about cash payoffs. Nevertheless, I feel like by analyzing these special cases, one still gets some interesting and informative insights into how to optimally design trade across these different environments. And let me now just briefly summarize some of the main findings. Okay, so first of all, I solve for optimal mechanisms which maximize convex combinations of expected revenue and allocative efficiency. And I find that the double auction, which is the mechanism that's typically assumed in this literature, it is not optimal. Um, and the reason why it's not optimal is because it has a tendency to distort the allocations of traders with more extreme endowments farther from the first best efficient allocation, relatively more than it does the allocations of traders with more intermediate endowments. But that's not optimal because those are precisely the traders who have the greatest urgency to trade. And so optimal mechanisms will have the opposite property. And perhaps surprisingly, across each of the different settings for which I'm able to characterize optimal mechanisms, I show that they can be implemented by double auctions with transaction fees. So while the double auction is not optimal, one can kind of restore the optimality of these double auctions simply by adding some transaction fees on top. Okay, these transaction fees depend only on the trade quantity and the clearing price in the auction. I also find that the revenue maximizing incentives of a trading exchange will tend to harm information aggregation. So prices will tend to be less revealing. And I'll also characterize information structures which are in a sense worst case for allocative efficiency and the maximal guarantees of allocative efficiency that can be achieved by some mechanism. And I'll be more precise about what I mean by worst case later on in the talk. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be relatively brief concerning the related literature. As I mentioned, this paper is at the intersection of finance market microstructure and mechanism design. Within the literature on market microstructure, I analyze a variant of the quadratic holding cost setting, which I think has grown in popularity in the past decade and a half or so. So here I've listed many of papers that study variants of this setting. And I think a contribution of the paper is to show that that setting is actually very much amenable to mechanism design analysis. Now, within the literature on mechanism design of trade, it's quite an old literature. It dates back all the way to Meyerson and Satterthwaite, 1983 paper. I guess relative to this literature, I'm among the first papers to analyze optimal design of trade for objectives other than allocative efficiency in a setting where traders have concave utility over their asset positions, where there's several large traders, and where traders can be buyers or sellers endogenously based on the terms of trade. One of the most closely related papers, I think, is this paper by B.A. Montimore and Roche. They study a very closely related setting where traders also end up having quadratic utility. However, they study the case when there's a single agent. And in fact, most of their analysis is actually focused on the case when you have competing market designers. So I'm kind of studying the opposite case where I have multiple traders, but there's only a single designer. And that allows me to study exchange mechanisms where any quantity that a trader purchases must be supplied by some other trader in the market. Now, that being said, given the similarity of our model environments, a lot of the techniques I use to characterize optimal mechanisms is very much similar to the ones that BA, Montimore, and Roche use. And our optimal mechanisms will share many similar properties. For instance, there'll be an interior region of traders who have binding participation constraints, and transfer rules will have kinks in them. So these are kind of similar properties across both of our papers. Let me also mention a very nice contemporaneous paper by Andreanov, Park, and Sadzik. They study a very similar model setting to the one I study, but they assume ex post participation constraints, whereas I assume interim participation constraints. And as a result, I'm able to get perhaps a sharper characterization of optimal mechanisms. However, they also allow for more general utility functions. Okay. So with that, I think I'm just going to now move on to a roadmap for the rest of the talk. So what I'm going to start out with is introducing the most basic version of the model. Okay, this is going to be a model with a single traders, with a single asset, symmetric traders, a single round of trade. And then from there, I'll characterize the optimal mechanisms for that setting. Okay, this is the setting where I've obtained the sharpest results with the least conditions. And then after that, I'll systematically extend the analysis to consider richer settings, beginning first by introducing private signals about cash payoffs. And in the paper, I then further extend to allow for multiple assets, heterogeneity among traders, and to some degree also dynamics. But because of time constraints, I won't be able to cover that today. I'll just give you a little brief overview and then I'll conclude. Okay, so let me now jump into the baseline model. Okay, so there's going to be a single asset with a payoff pi that has mean mu pi. And there's going to be n large and strategic traders. Each trader is endowed with some quantity EI of the asset prior to trade. And I'll assume that this endowment is drawn IID from some given CDF capital F, defined on some interval of the real line, with a mean mu E and a density that's positive. Okay. So as I mentioned, traders in this model are going to have quadratic utility. So in particular, their utility will be quasi-linear in cash transfers. Okay, so this is the utility from the assets payoff, and TI is the total price paid to purchase the some quantity of the asset, XI. And there's a quadratic holding cost over the post-trade asset position. Okay, this could represent aversion to risk associated with the asset's payoff. It could represent the cost of having to satisfy certain regulatory capital requirements, among other things. And in what follows, I'll call kappa a trader's holding capacity, because when kappa is higher, this quadratic holding cost is lower. Okay. So the objective of the designer is to choose a mechanism to maximize some convex combination of expected revenue and expected allocative efficiency. Where here I'm measuring allocative efficiency by the sum of traders' quadratic holding costs. And here alpha is some parameter between 0 and 1 that represents the weight on revenue in the objective. Now, by the revelation principle, we can restrict attention to direct mechanisms, where the transfer rules and the allocation rules are functions of traders' truthfully reported endowments. So here, vec E is the vector of traders' endowments. And the mechanism has to satisfy certain constraints. So it must be incentive compatible for each trader to truthfully report her endowment to the mechanism. That's this first constraint. It also must be individually rational for each trader to participate in the mechanism. That is, the expected utility from participating and reporting truthfully exceeds the utility from simply retaining one's own endowment and not paying anything. And finally, the mechanism must be one of pure exchange. So the designer does not absorb or supply any net quantity of the asset. Okay, so the total quantity allocated is 0 for each realization of traders' endowments. So at this point, I think it would be a good time for me to pause and ask if there are any questions.
All right, if anyone has a question, the way to ask that would be to raise your hand, and then I can click a button and allow you to unmute yourself. I don't see any questions yet, Daniel.
All right, thanks.
Let's maybe pause for just a second to see if any materialize. Okay, looks like you're clear to keep going ahead.
All right. So what I'm going to do now is basically show you what these optimal mechanisms look like, and then hopefully make a little bit of progress towards addressing some of those questions I posed at the start of this talk. Okay. So the following theorem characterizes optimal mechanisms, so the solutions to the problem I just posed, under some relatively permissive technical conditions on the CDF-F. It turns out that the unique solution for the optimal allocation rule is of the following form. Okay. Each trader, how much a trader purchases in the mechanism is going to be of the following form. So the trader is going to unload some function V of his endowment in the mechanism, which I'll call the virtual endowment of the trader, and I'll explain what that is shortly. And then the trader is going to absorb an equal share of the aggregate virtual endowment of the other traders in the market. Okay, so why am I calling this object the virtual endowment? Well, let's suppose that it's very similar to Meyerson 1981. So let's suppose that the virtual endowment was a trader's true endowment. Okay, then this allocation would simply be the efficient allocation, right? Because these traders have convex holding costs. And so the efficient thing to do is to allocate the same quantity of the asset to each trader post-trade. And so to achieve that, this is how much each trader would have to purchase if the virtual endowment was the true endowment. Okay. Now, the designer can't simply extract all the surplus from traders. Okay. And so as a result, the designer is not necessarily going to want to implement the efficient outcome. Because the designer may care also about revenue. The designer is going to have to account for incentive constraints and participation constraints. And so rather than implementing the efficient allocation, he's going to implement something that looks like it, but for these virtual endowments, which kind of distort the trader's true endowments to capture the shadow costs of binding incentive and participation constraints. So let me now kind of explain to you what the virtual endowment looks like. So there's going to be an interior region, EA to EB, of traders whose participation constraints bind. Okay, and for those traders, the virtual endowment is simply constant and equal to the expected virtual endowment. Okay, if you plug in the expected virtual endowment into this allocation rule, you'll notice that these are exactly the types of traders who anticipate that they expect to trade zero in the mechanism. Okay, and that's intuitive that these are the agents for which participation constraints bind, right? Because they don't expect to trade much in the mechanism, so they don't expect to gain much from participation. Now, outside of this interior region of binding participation constraints, we have explicit solutions for the virtual endowment. And the virtual endowment essentially there just captures the shadow costs of binding incentive constraints. And so it looks rather similar to the virtual types in Meyerson 1981. Okay. So how do we actually compute this region, EA to EB? Well, we apply the principle of smooth fit. So these constants have to be chosen so that the virtual endowment is continuous. Okay, so this is actually a pretty sharp and simple characterization of optimal mechanisms. At the end of the day, there are only three unknowns: the expected virtual endowment and the endpoints of the region where participation constraints bind. And this tractability is really what's key for this paper, and being able to extend the analysis to study different environments of interest and also to derive comparative statics results. So to give you some more intuition about what these optimal mechanisms look like, let me now present an example for the case when the CDF of traders' endowments are uniform. Okay, so here I'm plotting the expected trade quantity as a function of a trader's endowment in the optimal mechanism. That's here in black. Okay, in blue, I'm plotting the first best efficient allocation, which maximizes allocative efficiency. And then here in green, I'm plotting the expected trade quantity under the double auction, the uniform price double auction for symmetric linear equilibrium. So as you can see, the double auction has a tendency to distort the allocations of traders from first best relatively more for traders with more extreme endowments. Optimal mechanisms, however, have the opposite property. The expected trade quantity actually, at least for this example, has no distortion for the extreme types. And the distortion increases as traders have more intermediate endowments. The region where this flat region corresponds to the region where participation constraints bind. Okay, as you can see, it depends on the parameter alpha, which is the weight on revenue in the objective. And typically when alpha is higher, this flat region is going to be bigger and trades less efficient. So on the right-hand side here, I'm plotting the expected transfer of a trader as a function of the endowment. As you can see, under the double auction, the transfer is more convex than under the first best efficient allocation. Okay, that's because of the well-known inefficiencies arising from price impact. Okay, that's what's causing that. However, under the optimal mechanism, okay, these expected transfers have these concave regions. And these concave regions are effectively quantity discounts. And the purpose of them is to incentivize traders with more extreme allocation, more extreme endowments to trade more aggressively. Okay, that's why there's less distortion in the expected trade quantities under the optimal mechanism. Okay, now the transfer rule is kinked because that's what gives rise to this flat region where traders with the same endowments end up trading the same quantities. So here I'm plotting how expected revenue per trader and the expected holding cost of a trader change as the number of traders changes. So as you can see, under the first best and double auction, the expected revenue per trader is simply going to be zero. However, under the optimal mechanism, the expected revenue per trader gradually increases before converging. So why does it increase? It's because of um, the fact that traders are risk averse with respect to their post-trade asset positions. And when you have more traders, uh, a kind of law of large numbers kicks in, and there's less volatility. There's less variance in the average aggregate virtual endowment, which these traders must absorb. And as a result, the designer can kind of extract more revenue. So here we can see that the expected holding cost of a trader is decreasing for each of the different mechanisms. For the optimal mechanism and the double auction, it eventually vanishes. Okay, this is because price impact costs are disappearing for the double auction, and so the green line should converge to the blue line. Interestingly, when the number of traders is exactly 3, the optimal mechanism, which maximizes revenue, has the same expected holding cost for a trader as under the double auction. So they have equal allocative efficiency in that case. Okay, and so what this suggests is that the double auction isn't actually an efficient mechanism. Okay, and indeed, here I'm plotting the revenue efficiency frontier. So I've computed the optimal mechanism for each value of alpha. That's this black curve. And this green dot corresponds to the double auction. And as you can see, the double auction is not on this black curve. It's inefficient. And so one might wonder what the optimal mechanisms that comprise this black curve actually resemble. Okay, I've given you a characterization of them in terms of direct mechanisms. But is there some kind of indirect implementation that might resemble some of the institutions we see in practice? And the answer is yes. And it turns out that one can actually restore the double auction to this frontier simply by introducing some carefully calibrated transaction fees. So I'll describe that in more detail now. So a double auction with transaction fee calligraphic T operates in 3 stages. So each trader will submit a demand schedule, which specifies how much the trader will purchase in the auction as a function of the clearing price. And then the clearing price is computed so that the total trade quantity is 0. Now, finally, in addition to paying the per unit clearing price, traders are going to pay this function calligraphic T, which depends on the trade quantity that the trader purchases and also the clearing price. And so this additional transaction fee, it turns out, is all that you need to be able to implement optimal allocations. And in fact, in the paper, I show how one can explicitly compute these transaction fees to target whatever point one wants to obtain on the frontier. Okay. So before I give some intuition for why this is true, let me just briefly note some policy relevant implications. So I think what this result suggests is that transaction fees can be a remarkably powerful tool and a non-invasive one that can be used to achieve desirable market outcomes. Indeed, as I mentioned, by calibrating these transaction fees, the planner can target any desired point on the revenue efficiency frontier. And in practice, exchanges often charge transaction fees that kind of resembles the ones that I've derived. For example, these maker-taker fees, right? Maker-taker fees are remarkably complicated. They depend on often trade volumes and they are often changing all the time and tailored to market conditions. And so I think the transaction fees I'm proposing aren't particularly more complicated than what's actually been used in practice. And indeed, there is a large literature that studies these fees, both empirically and theoretically. And finally, though my model doesn't feature any competition among exchanges, uh, I think what it suggests is that depending on the degree of competition in the market, allowing exchanges to set transaction fees can either exacerbate or mitigate allocative inefficiency. Uh, why? If you think of there being greater competition as kind of representing a situation in which designers will place more weight on efficiency uh, in order to attract traders to their exchanges, then you would expect them to put in place certain transaction fees that are more efficient. But if you have just a monopolist who's trying to maximize revenue, then they're going to put a lot of weight on revenue, and you're going to have a great deal of inefficiency if you allow them to set transaction fees. But this is just suggestive because I have not studied the analysis with competition. I have not studied the case with competition. Okay. So let me just give a brief intuition for why this result is true. So here I've just rewritten the equation for the optimal allocation rule. And as you can notice, there's a common component to each trader's allocation, which is the aggregate virtual endowment. Okay, so when traders are participating in a market, what is it that really links their trade quantities? It's going to be the price in the market, right? And so based off that intuition, the idea is to try to reverse an equilibrium of the double auction such that the price is the aggregate virtual endowment. Okay, and it turns out this is so if each trader submits the following demand schedule. Okay, indeed, you can see this if you just plug in the price as the aggregate virtual endowment. You see if you sum across these trade quantities, it has to be zero. Okay, so then with that observation, the proof boils down to reverse engineering a transaction fee so that each trader indeed finds it optimal to submit this demand schedule. So it turns out the optimal transaction fees of the following form. Okay, there's a constant here, A. That's just to make sure it's individually rational for each trader to participate in the mechanism. And then there's some quadratic term. And finally, there's some nonlinear term. And together, by toggling this quadratic term's coefficient and carefully choosing this nonlinear function tau, one can incentivize traders to submit the correct demand schedule. And so we get the optimal we get an implementation of the optimal allocation that way. Okay, so before I go on to talk about what happens when traders also have private information about fundamentals, let me pause here and ask if there are any questions.
All right, thanks. Marius, you had a question that you wrote in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and ask that question live.
All right, thanks, Josh. Thanks for the presentation, Daniel. This looks really great. One thing I was wondering about is if you have any meaningful notion of intermediation or liquidity provision. It seems that in the model, everybody arrives at the market at the same time, and the mechanism just allocates endowments. But in reality, buyers and sellers will arrive asynchronously, and that will create an intermediation sector. And for them, market structure rules matter. For example, time priority will influence how much risk you're willing to intermediate, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you're addressing this sort of intermediation
Yeah,
topic, which
that's
is
a great
central.
question.
Yeah.
So my model is definitely quite stylized, and it abstracts away from those sorts of issues which would naturally lead to um, intermediation, at least for the baseline model, because everybody's present in the market at the same time. Now, I think that would be an interesting direction to extend the analysis. Let me actually mention, I won't be able to show you the results today, but there is a sense in which intermediation kind of naturally arises for the setting when traders are heterogeneous with respect to their risk or their holding capacities. In that setting, you'll sort of see that traders with high holding capacities will start to function like specialists or market makers, and they're kind of there to absorb liquidity in exchange for better terms of trade. And so you kind of get something similar appearing there, but but it's not quite exactly the effects that you've mentioned. And I think that would be interesting to explore, and certainly a very relevant aspect of practical functioning markets that I'm abstracting from.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. If anyone else has a question that they'd like to ask, please raise your hand, and maybe in the meantime, I'll ask a question of my own. So Daniel, you had kind of this nice result about how the optimal mechanism can be implemented as a double auction with transaction fees. And I guess my question is, like, the class of double auctions with transaction fees, like how large of a class of mechanisms is that? And I guess I'm kind of thinking that if it turned out that like any mechanism you can actually implement as a double auction with transaction fees, then this result doesn't have a lot of content, but kind of the more restrictive this class of mechanisms is, then the more content there is in your result. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can't achieve every mechanism. You can't achieve every allocation implementable by some mechanism with double auctions with transaction fees. So it does have some bite. It does use some properties of the optimal mechanisms I've characterized. You can get more than simply the optimal mechanisms. You can, but you can't get everything. So for example, one might imagine, suppose you run two separate double auctions and you sort of segment the traders. Uh, I don't think you can implement that outcome using double auctions with transaction fees. Because I think at the end of the day, each trader's allocation still has to have some exposure to every other trader. So, and so you can't get everything with it. That's a great question.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay. I don't see any other hands up, so I think you're clear to continue.
All right, so let me now talk about what happens when traders have signals about cash payoffs. So for purely expositional reasons, let me set the mean of the asset's payoff to be 0. And let's suppose now that each trader sees a signal of this cash payoff. In order to really place the focus on the signals, I'm going to assume that traders' endowments are actually independent of the asset's payoff and also of signals. But other than that, I'll retain all other aspects of the baseline model. Now, one immediately runs into some challenges. Okay, so first of all, what's the right information structure to assume? What's the right joint distribution between signals and pi? If we in most models we actually study in market microstructure, the information structure is going to feature correlation in the signals. And then we're going to run into this well-known kind of issue where you have these Kramer-McLean type mechanisms where you can kind of extract a lot of surplus as the designer, but these mechanisms are kind of very delicate and depend very sensitively on the details of the environment and common knowledge assumptions, and we kind of don't like that in microtheory. And so that's one immediate issue. A second issue is now we have two dimensions of private information. Each trader has his private endowment and also his private signal. And multidimensional screening is notoriously difficult. And so let me give you a sense of kind of how I try to circumvent these challenges. So to do that, I'm going to take a little detour and talk about worst case information structures for the double auction setting. Okay, so let's suppose that each trader I sees a real valued signal of the cash payoff pi. And without loss of generality, I'm going to simply assume that this signal, zeta I, is equal to the posterior expectation. Okay. So further, let's suppose that it is known that these signals are Gaussian. And moreover, the joint distribution between signals and cash payoffs is also Gaussian. And that the correlation between any two signals is equal to some positive constant. Okay, that's just for symmetry. And I think the case when these signals are at least weakly positively correlated, that seems to me, at least intuitively, to be the more empirically relevant case. And again, for symmetry, I'll assume that the joint distribution between a trader's signal and the cash payoff is the same for all traders. So the only thing we're really agnostic about is the correlation structure between signals and also the fundamental payoff. We don't know what rho is. So in other words, we don't know the nature of the interdependencies in traders' valuations. And we don't know how these signals combine to give the best estimate of the fundamental. So within this ambiguity class, and fixing the double auction, a natural question to ask is perhaps which information structure is in fact worst case for allocative efficiency? Well, the answer is kind of given by the following theorem. First of all, if a symmetric linear equilibrium exists, then it turns out it's unique. And we can give sharp conditions for when there's existence. It turns out that the parameter range of equilibrium existence expands when there's greater correlation in signals, which I think is intuitive. And moreover, conditional on equilibrium existence, allocative efficiency is actually increasing in the correlation among signals. And so, in fact, the worst case information structure for allocative efficiency is such that trader signals are independent. Okay, and so the expectation of the fundamental pi given trader signals is just going to be the sum of their signals. So given that these are the worst case information structures, they kind of represent situations where it's very hard to, where adverse selection concerns are particularly severe. I think it makes sense to investigate which mechanisms perform well for these information structures. Okay. So that's one question that kind of comes to mind. Another is there a sense in which these are worst case information structures that does not depend on the assumption of the double auction mechanism, on symmetry or Gaussianity of the signals? And are there mechanisms that offer better guarantees than double auctions? In fact, because the equilibrium does not necessarily exist, there are some situations where the double auction doesn't even deliver a guarantee. And so is there a mechanism that does offer non-trivial guarantees for any parameters? And if so, what is the max guarantee that one can obtain in general? So it turns out that I'll be able to answer these questions by investigating the optimal design of trading mechanisms for a particular information structure. So I'm going to assume that each trader's signal is now distributed according to some CDFG, which is arbitrary, it doesn't have to be Gaussian. And moreover, that the best estimate of the fundamental is such that it's just the sum of traders' signals. Okay. So by solving for optimal mechanisms for these information structures, it turns out I'll be able to offer some answers to these questions. It also turns out to be the case that these are the only information structures for which I can actually derive optimal mechanisms. Okay, the idea is that the independence of the signals and the additive structure of these estimates causes the two dimensions of private information to ultimately collapse onto one dimension, which I'll call TI. So each trader's optimal message to the mechanism is going to depend only on this one-dimensional variable. And so one can use very similar methods to the ones I used for the baseline model to characterize optimal mechanisms. So it turns out that under technical conditions on the CDF of this one-dimensional statistic, the unique solution for the optimal allocation rule is pretty much of a very similar form to the solution to the baseline model. Okay, the only distinction is now, instead of the true endowment of the trader in these virtual evaluations, instead of the true endowment, it's simply replaced with the best estimate of a trader's endowment given his reported type. So to give some intuition, I think it's useful to walk through an example. Um, so here's a case when endowments and signals are all Gaussian. Here I'm plotting the expected trade quantity as a function of the effective type. As you can see, qualitatively, things aren't too different from the case we showed earlier for the uniform case without private signals. So when sigma squared zeta increases, that's the variance of these private signals. When that goes up, adverse selection concerns get worse, and the distance between the first best trade quantity and the double auction trade quantity widens, and eventually this green line becomes flat because trade will break down once adverse selection is sufficiently severe. However, trade will never break down under the optimal mechanism. Here I'm plotting the expected transfer as a function of the effective types. Again, things look quite similar to the expected transfers before. However, you'll notice that now the first best efficient mechanism has a transfer rule that's more convex than under the double auction. And I think the intuition for this is at some point adverse selection becomes so severe that equilibrium in the double auction kind of breaks down. So trade quantities go to zero, and so of course expected transfers aren't going to have much curvature. But that's not the case under the first best mechanism, where there's always where trade doesn't break down at a finite point when sigma squared zeta increases. So here I'm plotting the revenue efficiency frontier as I increase sigma squared zeta. That is the variance of private signals. So you can see the frontier shifts down over time as I increase sigma squared zeta. This green dot represents the double auction, and it shifts left, and eventually you hit autarky very quickly after increasing sigma squared zeta. Okay. Now, one might have thought that with private signals, it wouldn't be possible to implement optimal allocations with transaction fees, but it turns out that it is indeed still possible. So even with adverse selection, transaction fees can restore the optimality of the double auction. And in fact, they can restore market function even when there doesn't exist a symmetric linear equilibrium of the double auction. And it's actually a very simple proof. It follows the same layout as the one I gave earlier. You simply add a term that offsets price inference effects to these transaction fees. Okay. Now, I think one implication of the analysis is that information aggregation is harmed when the designer cares about revenue. So here I'm kind of making that formal in this corollary. So suppose endowments and signals are Gaussian. Whenever a symmetric linear equilibrium of the double auction without transaction fees exists, then the price in that equilibrium is more Blackwell informative about pi, the cash payoff, than the price in the equilibrium of the double auction with transaction fees that are set optimally whenever the weight on revenue is positive. Okay. And this result depends on the form of the optimal mechanism. You may have thought the moment the optimal mechanism isn't efficient, you'll have less information aggregation, but that's not so. For example, you can introduce a quadratic transaction fee, and that's going to have no impact on information aggregation. Okay, because you're still going to have a symmetric linear equilibrium in that case. And so prices will still just be proportional to the sum of traders' private information. A common intuition is that prices become more informationally efficient when the number of traders is large and each trader has only a small piece of private information, but that's not the case here. This result holds for any number of traders n. So why is it true? I should give some intuition. The reason is that under the optimal mechanisms, you have these interior regions where traders are pooled. Traders with the same types submit the same messages. And so in the equilibrium of the double auction, if traders with the same types are submitting the same demand schedules, of course, the price cannot distinguish between these types. And so that's what's causing this reduction in information aggregation. So I promised you I would give a sense in which these information structures that I'm studying are worst case, that doesn't depend as much on the assumptions of a double auction or Gaussianity, et cetera. And let me just very quickly go through this, just give you the idea, and then I'll get ready to conclude. So suppose nature and the designer play a zero-sum game. All right, let's suppose that nature selects an information structure and an equilibrium to minimize allocative efficiency, subject to the constraint that these signals are all distributed according to the CDFG, and subject to that the correlation in the signals is weakly positive. And suppose the designer, on the other hand, selects the trading mechanism to maximize allocative efficiency. Well, it turns out that there's an equilibrium of this zero-sum game where the designer selects a mechanism with the allocation rule given in the theorem that I just stated earlier, that's optimal when there's no weight on revenue, when alpha is 0. And nature will turn out to choose an information structure exactly of the form that I've assumed this whole time, where these signals are all independent and combine additively to give the best estimate of the fundamental. Okay, so this is a sense in which these information structures are worst case, where I haven't made any ex ante, ad hoc assumptions on the trading mechanism, or have made any restrictions that the CDFG is Gaussian or that these correlations are all symmetric. Okay. So because of the time constraint, I'm not going to sketch a proof of the theorem. So let me just briefly give you an idea of what goes on in the rest of the paper. So in the rest of the paper, I extend the analysis to consider multiple assets, trader heterogeneity, and dynamics. Of course, in some of these settings, I'll also have to make some restrictions on traders' private information. Across each of the settings that I characterize, it turns out that the basic qualitative features of the optimal mechanisms that I've identified continue to persist. Okay, so traders will unload their virtual endowments. They'll absorb an equal share of the aggregate virtual endowment. There's going to be an interior region of binding participation constraints. Moreover, perhaps surprisingly, double auctions with transaction fees across each of these settings can implement optimal outcomes. Okay, and in the case when there are multiple assets, this can be done by running separate double auctions. So basically, there's a single security traded in each double auction, and you don't need to allow for joint market clearing. You can allow these auctions to clear separately. However, you need more richer transaction fees. You need these cross-exchange transaction fees, which depend on the trade quantities on all of the auctions and the prices in all of the auctions. With trader heterogeneity, you can again implement optimal outcomes with double auctions, but now you need trader-specific transaction fees. And as I mentioned earlier in my answer to Marcus's question, traders with high holding capacity will function like specialists who are kind of given very good terms of trade in order to absorb the endowments of the other traders in the market. So in a version of the model where traders have flow utility, as long as there's only shocks at time 0, it turns out the analysis of optimal mechanisms reduces to the static model. So it's optimal to execute all trades at time 0. Of course, this is stark and not particularly realistic, but I think it's useful to obtain an upper bound on what's achievable in these settings. And some papers do assume only an initial shock at time 0. With renewed shocks, one can implement the efficient allocation with double auctions, but again, using transaction fees. Okay. So let me conclude. So the goal of this paper was to conduct a mechanism design analysis of a workhorse model in finance market microstructure. I've given a tractable characterization of optimal mechanisms across a range of settings. These optimal mechanisms resemble double auctions with transaction fees. The worst case information structures that are especially difficult to deal with feature independent signals with additive structure. And whenever exchanges have incentives to generate revenue, then prices can be less informative. So on a broader level, what do I see as the purpose of the paper? I think there's been relatively less mechanism design analysis of exchange in financial market contexts, but I think it's potentially very useful because it can help us to better understand a primitive environment that's often assumed in existing work. We can use it to investigate how existing results might change when the mechanism is endogenous. For example, as it concerns information aggregation or joint clearing of exchanges, etc. And one can also use these analyses to derive normative insights into how we should design trade as a society. Of course, the model I'm assuming is quite stylized, so any normative conclusions should be taken with a high degree of skepticism. But I think one can still learn some meaningful things, like exactly how effective these transaction fees are, and given that they're not very invasive, I think that's kind of maybe a robust conclusion. And I think there's a lot of that these transaction fees can be very beneficial. And I think there's a lot of scope for future work to extend the analysis to study more further important and interesting issues, like what happens when there's competing exchanges who set these transaction fees, and also to consider richer analyses of dynamic settings. So thanks so much. With that, I think I'll end the presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. Let's now open it up for further questions. And Daniel has said that he's willing to stick around past the official end at the top of the hour in case we have questions that take us past that point. But I see a hand from Albert. Albert, let me ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted, right?
Oh, okay. You beat me to it. Go ahead.
I hacked it, the system. Thanks, Daniel, for this
Fire away.
extremely interesting talk. I think you said it right. Even though it's abstract, it's very powerful in what it has to say about optimal design of exchanges. One thing that I wonder how robust it is your claim about the informational efficiency. That I see that when some intermediate range of traders get pooled, then you sort of don't see what their signals are that are coming to the market, and therefore it's less informative. But that critically depends on giving them an equally precise signal. If I'm taking all these traders and I throw the signals across the community of traders, but some get very precise signals, some do not. My intuition is that the people that get very precise signals become, in some sense, your extremes. So they'll be the ones who are very eager to trade, and so they'll land in those corners that your optimal design wants. Your optimal mechanism wants these people to trade, and then given that they've gotten the strongest signals, their information gets revealed into prices, and then you might have informational efficiency restored. So my question is this intuition correct, that if I allow for heterogeneity in the precision of signals, that you might restore informational efficiency?
That's a great question. I think the logic that you described makes a lot of sense, and uh, and I think that could potentially happen when traders are heterogeneous, right? As you mentioned, when they have heterogeneity in the precision of their signals. Um, yeah, I think that's a fair point, and that's something that's worth exploring to see when these mechanisms, whether or not these optimal mechanisms can actually be more informationally efficient than the double auction when there's significant heterogeneity.
Yeah,
Um,
and one more thought. Maybe a suggestion. I really like your result about the double auction mechanism not being being in some sense far from the optimal design.
mhm.
And I think I understand why this is happening, because you want the people at the extremes, at the tails, to really trade a lot to generate, in some sense, welfare, allocative efficiency. It'd be nice to have some result, if that's possible, that maybe if you have the distribution of these endowments, I guess, be more fat-tailed in a way that you get a larger distance between these two, double auction and the optimal design. So to the extent that you have more extreme types, then the wedge might become larger, and that might be a useful way to convey this intuition. And do you see what I'm saying, or I might be completely off?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're suggesting I do some kind of comparative static, like depending on the thickness of the tails.
Yeah. But that's just a thought I wanted to share, but I learned a lot. Thanks a lot.
Oh,
I'll give other people the room to ask questions.
thanks. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. I should say I think that example gave good intuition for why the double auction can be much less efficient. I should say it's not necessarily true all the time. That, in other words, I think there can be instances where the optimal mechanism has greater distortion in the expected trade quantities, even for relatively extreme types. Um, so so a numerical example. I think when the CDF is Gaussian is exponential, you get that property. So it's not always true, but so I'm still trying to get good intuition for what's going on. But at least for that example, with the uniform and more generally, whenever the CDFs are symmetric about the mean, then you have this property that there's less distortion at the extremes under optimal mechanisms. But it's not always true if you have an asymmetric distribution.
Uh,
So that's a good comparative static suggestion. Yeah.
uh, so, I'm sorry. So this is Chester Spat. So I have a kind of a comment. I'm not sure I fully understood yet the full connection to the transaction, to the access fee and transaction fee results. But I did want to mention to you the following, to the extent that it might be germane to your analysis. So for the first time in 20 years, the SEC has now intervened. Well, or is making another attempt to intervene on this issue. In its September rulemaking in the market structure space, it did two key things. I believe it brought down the cap on the access fees on the fee part from 0.3 of a cent to 0.1 of a cent per share. It had been 0.3 of a cent per share ever since NMS was adopted, and at the time that was actually already the prevailing practice. So basically it just kind of confirmed the practice. And the other change which it did in the September rulemaking was it said that the fees had to be well defined at the time of the transaction. In effect, before there was tiering, the fees often had the rebates, especially often had tiering. The tiering basically meant there were bigger discounts to the JP Morgan Chases and the Goldman Sachses of the world that was sending lots of volume through. But the tiering was determined ex post after the end of the month. So when the parties put in their orders, they wouldn't necessarily know what the rebates would be, or even their brokers wouldn't know what the rebates would be. And the SEC, while it didn't bar tiering in September, it basically said the tiering it already had to be defined by the time of the trade. So in effect, like for an airline frequent flyer program, it had to be based upon past activity as opposed to future or current activity. So anyway, I wanted to call these issues to your attention in case it affects both the issue of the leveling and the issue of the structuring of the fees, in case it affects the deeper economics, which, as I said, I haven't fully internalized yet.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, I know that they had put a cap of I think 30 cents per 100 shares, like around like the early 2000s, and so I wasn't aware of the fact that they were lowering the cap again. So that's very good to know. Thanks.
Okay, it looks like we also have a question from Marcus. Marcus, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for a very interesting
Mhm.
talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether it's incentive compatible to use the exchange. So I would be worried if you implement your optimal mechanism that it might get very expensive for certain traders to participate in that exchange. So is there a sense in which, let's say, high endowment or high volume traders might spin off and do their own private exchange and not use the exchange, or even worse, free ride on the price of the exchange, and, along those lines? Do you have any is incentive compatibility, or sorry, is the participation assumed in your analysis, or is it optimal?
Oh yeah, so it's optimal for each trader to participate in the mechanism. Now, I haven't considered the possibility that some traders may spin off their own exchange. So if they could somehow coordinate to run a new trading mechanisms amongst themselves, that might be possible. And indeed, I think more generally, it would be very nice to study a version of the model where you had competition among mechanism designers, exchange designers.
So I think if you look at the history of, I think, bond markets, they used to be on exchange, and then it was exactly that story, that large traders then went off, over the counter, and then and so maybe now it's platforms. There's certainly a certain dynamic of, when the incentives are higher to circumvent the exchange and find alternative ways to trade. So I think that might be an interesting direction to go.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. So I think if those are concerns, like if you're concerned about traders kind of coordinating to start a new trading mechanism, I obviously I've not done the formal analysis, but I anticipate that it may be possible that it would look similar to simply putting a higher weight on allocative efficiency and the designer's objective. That's not I mean that's not a formal claim, and that should be formalized, but you see what I mean? If you give more surplus to the traders, maybe then you would dissuade them from spinning off.
Right. Do we have any other questions? Last call. Okay, well, in that case, let's thank Daniel once again for a nice presentation. And thanks to all of you for attending. One more reminder to please submit your work to our call for papers. The submission deadline is the 15th, and we'll see you back in the spring. Until then, happy holidays.